Man, I felt so much conviction reading this. Like,
Yeah.
these disciples not staying awake
Come on.
was me.
It's me. That was me last night in my prayer closet.
This is me.
That was me. I
Like,
was like,
I don't know, man. Like, I feel like I hear Jesus looking now. You can't stay up with me but 1 hour. Like,
for 1 hour?
like,
Listen, I was like 7 minutes in, knocked out. I heard myself snoring. It was bad.
Yo, welcome back to the Vibes Daily Podcast. It is day 292 of our year-long series we have titled Devoted, as we journey through the entire Bible from cover to cover, from Genesis to Revelation. I am back and again joined by my wife, Victoria, as we close out the book of Matthew here.
Yeah.
Last 3 chapters of Matthew. I've missed you the last few days. I've been talking over with your mom and covering Matthew there, but I am back to close us out before the end of this week. And so, yeah, Matthew 26 is where we pick up. Jesus had just finished sharing a few different parables. You guys got to talk about my favorite parable yesterday in chapter 25, the sheep and the goat, which is where it left off. I won't add anything to it.
I know we don't talk about you the whole time, though.
It's all right.
You're in our hearts.
I appreciate you. Shout me out too. But we pick up here in chapter 26, and this is where the gospel read takes a turn. This is where we start to get to the end of Jesus's life. The plot to kill him, his betrayal, ultimately his crucifixion. That's kind of what we will cover all here today. So his ministry, his work is essentially almost complete. Kind of hit the tail end here. And so we pick up on chapter 26 and people are scheming.
They always scheming, but my goodness.
They are scheming.
They were scheming so much that, like, I don't know, my version in verse 4, it says, and they conspired to arrest Jesus in a treacherous way and kill him. Like, they weren't even trying to be like soft about anything. It was like, yeah, no, we going in. Yeah.
I mean, there's a part of me that, like, as I read this, that I come to think, like, it feels extreme to want to kill Jesus. Right? Like, versus just imprisoning him, locking him up, maybe even just teaching against him, like,
or banning him from the cities, right?
Except exile, banish, something of that nature. You would think, but I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, in that time and in that context, penalty for, like, blasphemy. Or for anything that was like that, it was death.
That was death, and was like stoned.
Like that was literally what like, if he was not Jesus, probably, like, if he did not have the following he had and the people behind him, they probably would have just stoned him by now. And would have been justified if all the people agreed with the things that he had said. The issue was
the people.
They followed him. And they listened and they believed. And so they had to come up with a different way to ultimately get rid of him. And that's what we kind of see here.
Because that's what he says in verse 5, right? It's like they conspired to kill him. It said, but not during the time of the festival, they said, so there won't be rioting among the people. And so it's like they continuously, you would see that they would come and challenge him, the scribes or the Pharisees or Sadducees. I mean, I felt like they was just sending person after person. Okay, Pharisees, you go in. Okay, Sadducees, y'all try. Okay, scribes, you go and get it. And I feel like at each point it was like they could not do anything to him at that point because of the people.
So ultimately to become successful, we'll get to later in 26, they had to kind of have an inside man and someone kind of within Jesus's own crew that would do that. But just before that, there's kind of this precious moment that we get a little bit more insight into in some of the later gospels, but we do get kind of a picture here of this woman in this alabaster jar that anoints his head, and kind of almost like a pre-burial ritual, or typically a post-burial ritual, but for him it was a ritual for him. What, anything stick out to you kind of in those verses 6 through 16 that you thought was significant?
Well, the first thing was that he was at a leper's house, right? That like he's at Simon the leper's house. He must have killed him already, of course, but just the fact that like he would even be in a leper's house, right, was just like not even heard of. Like, people, we just don't do that. Like, even if you say you healed, I might still not come to your house for a few years just to make sure I don't get leprosy, right? So the fact that that Jesus was there was a big thing, a big takeaway for me. But then that other people were willing to come to him, like this woman in this leper's house too, was just like, and there's a party happening like in this man's house, and so that jumped out. But then like that she thought that he was worth so much that like she would take this expensive perfume. I mean, as you said, like Mark and some of the other gospels like allude to just like how expensive it was, like a year's worth of like wages, right? So you're just thinking like, okay, in our days, maybe $75,000 to $100,000 worth of perfume, right? That you just like pouring out on him, like, and he's poured on his head, and in my mind, I would have probably said the same thing, honestly. Like, why are you wasting? I mean, does he really need all of it? Like, give him a little drop, a couple, just to get the fragrance. But you would think of like how much, especially because I think it even changed it for me when I was watching The Chosen, about like how much they slept outside and were intense and sometimes didn't have food themselves. Like, I think I would be thinking like, you didn't have this, like, we could have used this. We could have sold this, not only gave some to the poor, but used it for ourselves too.
But I mean, I think it does show how easy it is for us to miss what's right in front of us,
right?
Like, because I think Jesus is clear. I mean, if you just go back to 25, right, that like he wants us to care for the poor. He does. But I think like what the disciples missed, his apostles that kind of are with him, is that like this moment with Jesus was worth everything. Right? Like, and just being with him and in his presence, like that was more valuable, right? Going back to even your favorite parable, like I would trade it all in. I would sell everything just for this kingdom, like just to be in this moment. And I think like it is really challenging. Like again, in no way is Jesus telling us that we should not give to the poor or sell that, because again, that would be contradictory to so many other things he taught. But I do think what he was trying to help the disciples see, and I think even for us to know, is that like these moments with him are more valuable and precious than anything. Right. And that just opportunity to worship him, to be before him. And I think that's really challenging, right? Because like how often would I use whatever other excuse, whether it's to either earn money or give money or whatever, right? To just not be with him. I think that was the challenge for me. But
and because he had just told them too that like, after 2 days, in verse 2, right? He said, the Passover takes place after 2 days, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Like, he literally just told them, like, I'm about to die, y'all.
Yeah, he said it multiple times.
Times. I mean, that's what also jumped out to me, just how many times he told them that he was about to die. Right? And so he's saying this, and he's probably like, I only got a few days left on this earth, right? And so you're right in that, and that being present with him in that moment, like phone free, distraction free, just in the moment with the Lord.
Yeah, which is what he ultimately says in a different version of this, that like the poor will always be with you.
They
right?
will.
And so like, he actually says it here in verse 11. So you always have the poor with you. And so I think like, to your point, that's what it was. I got 48 hours. So they're gonna still be here when you're done. But
and honoring this lady, I don't think I've ever noticed verse 13 where it says like, truly I tell you, the whole world, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Like, yikes. She made it into the history books.
Hilarious. Yeah. We don't get her name in this one, but still in this particular gospel, she's still known. But yeah, I mean, that it not quite clear if this is exactly what leads to it, but ultimately the very next thing we get is that Judas is walks off and essentially cuts a deal with the chief priest, right? And so again, I don't know if it's because of the weights, if it's because he's just upset, because it doesn't say because in this particular passage, but this is what ultimately leads to Jesus' betrayal. And so he goes and cuts a deal for 30 pieces of silver, which again we know from just Matthew's perspective of trying to prove Jesus is the Messiah. This is another prophecy being fulfilled, right? These 30 pieces of silver here. But Passover takes place. It's kind of starting in verse 17. If they get a house to do that in, and he again tells them somebody's going to betray me. Kind of Last Supper happens. I mean, just talk to me a little bit about the rest of 26 and what jumped out to you.
Yeah, I mean, just this willingness for this person to just like let Jesus use their house, right? I mean, I guess at this point he's a big deal, right? But just the fact he's like, go to a city to a certain man and just tell him like, I'm celebrating the Passover at your house. Like, just the willingness of people just to open up their houses. And maybe culturally that was just a different thing in a different time where that was also just more frequently happening, right? Because like even when we see like the two disciples after Jesus is crucified, like walking down the road, like they was like, come stay with us, people just was like, come stay with me. So maybe that was more of a thing, but that jumped out to me. But just like he predicted his crucifixion, he just also was continuously predicting that somebody was going to betray him. So in verse 21, that just jumped out to me that he's like not hiding these things.
Yeah definitely. What you gonna go and feel how awkward it must be among them, just looking around like which one of it is it? Which I've always heard it taught like that probably speaks to how Jesus treated everyone, that it was not clear which one betrayed him, right? Because he knew in advance that it was going to happen, but he didn't treat anybody any differently, right? Apparently, because if he had, I think everybody would have known, oh yeah, that's gonna be Judas, right?
Jesus don't mess with him.
So I think that's good. But I'll say kind of in the rest of 26, what probably jumped out to me, and there's a lot here, and some of these stories will come across again, right? Kind of in these other gospels. So I think one of the first things that felt most significant for 26 before we get to 27 for me was really this prayer in the garden. Man, I felt so much conviction reading this. These disciples not staying awake.
Come on.
Was me.
It's me. That was me last night in my prayer closet.
This is me.
That was me. I was like,
I don't know, man. Like I feel like I hear Jesus looking now. Again, I read this. Who knows? But now I just felt like I hear Jesus saying, "You can't stay up with me, but 1 hour." Like
for 1 hour.
Like,
listen, I was like 7 minutes in, knocked out. I heard myself snoring. It was bad.
Yeah. That's all bad. But I mean, I get it.
But and I think I was reading this one in Mark. I was reading this.
Yeah. Oh, that's hilarious.
And the conviction was so real.
That's hilarious. Yeah. It feels so real. Like, again, I appreciate these disciples aren't perfect. I appreciate these disciples they're trying, they making the same mistakes we making. Jesus is just as frustrated with them, right? And he done been with them for 3 years. I appreciate they're real people, but I also think that, like, again, it's a challenge. I think we hear Jesus' heart, and he wants us to pray with him. And I think the image I had was that, like, even now, Jesus is, I think Hebrews is who teaches us that, like, Jesus is still interceding on our behalf. Still. Right?
Yeah.
In prayer, that when we pray, he's the one that goes before the Father for us. And so it's like, it's almost this exact same image happening. Like, would you just stay up and pray with me? I'm praying for you on your behalf, like to the Father. Would you just pray with me?
That's good.
For those same things. And I think that's just like his plea to us. And that's what I see as this plea. Like, man, like you need this, you need the prayer. Your flesh is willing, to do some things.
Yeah.
But man, without the spirit, you're going to be weak.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Was there anything else in 26 that you thought was particularly significant?
Yeah. Well, right after that, when he's just like, okay, come on, y'all, my betrayer is here. He calls Judas, his betrayer, in 46. But then when Judas gets to him in 50, he calls him friend, right? They're like, I think one of our marriage studies points this out. That's the first time I noticed it, where like he knows he's being betrayed by Judas, and he comes up and he kisses him, betrays him, says, "Greetings, Rabbi." And Jesus could have used any other word to describe him or to acknowledge him, but he just says, "Friend, why have you come?" And that is so hard. Just to like, this is when we see Jesus really walking out what he teaches and preaches, right? Like to love your enemies.
Yeah.
Like right now, Judas is an enemy. He just called him a betrayer, and you are calling him a friend and accepting his kiss. Anybody else would be throwing hands.
Yeah.
On sight. But here, he calls him friend and just allows himself to be arrested. Now, part of Jesus just knows that this is his calling, right? This is part of his purpose, right? His main purpose in coming to earth, right? Was this moment of being betrayed and being crucified. But that really stuck out to me. But I also just love that he goes willingly, he goes humbly, but then in 53 he says, "Or do you think I cannot call on my Father and he'll provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels?" And I just love that, because it's kind of like, don't make me flex. Like I could if I wanted to. Like,
and it goes to Philippians 2, which I just appreciate that text so much.
Or like he empties himself.
Yeah, but that he humbled himself even to the point of the cross, right? Like to the point of death, and like even death on the cross. That is what Paul is describing. Paul is like, I don't think you guys understand. Jesus is God.
Yeah.
He could have stopped what happened at any point.
At any point.
He could have.
Yep.
But he chose to submit himself in that way, right? And so I do think like it is a picture of just sacrifice, of selflessness, of humility. And I think he was even, like you said, still trying to help people understand, your little sword, that don't mean nothing to me.
Yeah.
Like I don't need that. If I wanted to raise up an army, I could raise up an army.
Yeah.
If I wanted to go to war, I could go to war.
We'd be at war.
That's not what I'm trying to teach you. And you're missing it. And it's interesting because, like you said, it's right after he just calls Judas a friend, right? Like, so you think like, I'm trying to model to you what it looks like to love our enemies.
Yeah.
And you're still missing it.
But you're still
missing it.
Cutting off people's ears.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. And in general, like, one of the big takeaways, and I was on the conversation earlier this week, but one of the big characters in this piece is Peter. Right, which we find from another gospel that Peter is the one that does this, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't say Peter's name here, but Peter is also the one who's like, "I'll never deny you," and then denies him 3 times before the rooster even crows, like that same night, right? But like earlier this week, Peter's the one who declares him as Messiah, and then a few verses later, "Get thee behind me, Satan," to Peter, right? And I think like, so much of this helps me to see just that dynamic of just like growth and change, and like that in one moment you can be in the spirit, and the next moment you could be in the flesh, right? And just kind of that back and forth, because as much as Peter had all the fervor for Jesus, right? Even when he gets rebuked, it's because he's just like, "I don't want you to die, Jesus," right? And now he's trying to protect him. That like, on the flip side of that, under the right pressure in the right moment, he's willing to deny him. It just shows kind of some of that tension of how easy it is and how quickly. And I think that's what even Jesus is referring to about this prayer. He's like, look, your spirit is willing, your flesh is weak. Like, I need you to be in the spirit.
Yeah, this is probably why you should have been praying.
Yeah, this is why you should have been prayed up.
This is why you should have been prayed up for this moment. Because
if you had, maybe you wouldn't have acted this way, because you would have been in the spirit instead of in the flesh. And right now you're in the flesh, man. And it's just, it's if Peter learns it at some point, he's the one that tells us, be sober-minded and alert.
He sure
right?
does.
Later in scripture,
he sure does.
He's the one that tells us that because your enemy is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for those he can devour. Like, Peter's the one, he eventually gets it. But like, I think that is the charge. It's like, man, we gotta be prayed up. We gotta be.
Yeah.
On a regular basis. So
Yeah, he was trying to teach them how to do that.
Yeah, and model it, for himself. So again, I'm grateful for that. There's so much we learn from Jesus' life, and again, we have 3 more books that'll articulate some of that, and we'll get to that. But just kind of a quick looking at the last 2 chapters here in 27 and 28. 27 essentially gives us his charge before Pilate. They charge him with his crimes that they're accusing him of. He gets, Pilate is not really like understanding exactly what he did. Tries to let him off the hook, honestly, right? Yeah. Says, hey man, I got this other prisoner who's a murderer. Like, maybe you guys want to let this guy off instead. Maybe let Jesus off and let me, crucify Barabbas. Ultimately, they choose Jesus instead of Barabbas, which probably goes to show, like, man, how much they really disliked him. And he's ultimately mocked, crucified between these criminals, dies. There's kind of some things here. Talk to me a little about 27. What did you think was particularly interesting or significant here?
Yeah. So yeah, the first thing, which I don't really have too much in-depthness about, but I do think that was interesting that Judas felt so much remorse that he like took the silver back and like threw it in the temple, and that they was like, yeah, this is blood money. We can't let this stay in the temple, right? So I think that was interesting that like they even in themselves knew that this was not right. Like even the scribes and the priests, right? Like they also knew this money, what we just did, they knew it wasn't right, but that was the problem Jesus had with them, was their hearts, right? Always doing the wrong thing, like, but secretly. But then, like you said, once he gets to Pilate, I really just kind of stood back and paused when Pilate's wife came and sent word to him and said, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for today I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh wow, like even like God gave them a chance to like hands off, and not sin and be held accountable for anything, right? For his death.
Yeah. I think is significant about that though, that just hadn't really given much thought to before, is just the timing. Because like essentially Jesus is taken from the garden to Pilate almost, right? Like if you just think about the time, like he's arrested in the middle of the night, right? And he goes before Pilate that next morning, to ultimately be crucified. Like she is having these dreams before or while Jesus is even being arrested. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like she hears Jesus is arrested and then goes to sleep that night and then has these dreams. You know what I'm saying? It's it reminds me of like in Esther where, King Artaxerxes is like, can't sleep that night.
Yes.
And the guy brings, he's like, man, bring me my scrolls, the annals of history, essentially, my reign.
History book.
Yeah, my history book. And let's just read about what I've been doing. About what's going on.
Give me the most boring book you got.
Yeah, to put me to sleep, right? And it's just like he's so disturbed by that, and he can't sleep, that ultimately it's from that reading that he's able to, know to honor Mordecai. Ultimately is what comes from that, right? And how that dream saved Mordecai's life. Like it's almost like that. It's just like Jesus is like, or God is like working in Pilate's wife's dreams, to give Pilate a chance, and now ultimately Pilate wipes his hands clean and says, it's not up to me anyway, it's up to these people. But like I did think that was very interesting, the timing of it, that it's kind of happening almost simultaneously, which was interesting to me. But anything else that stuck out to you in 27?
Yeah, I don't know, just always reading the death, it just is so sad, honestly. Like the way that they describe how they beat him on the head and they spat at him and stuff, and like just to think of like, God, you could have had him just arrested and crucified, right? Without the in-betweens, but he had to get lashed and mocked and beaten on and broken down, like he had to endure so much that I was just like, did you really have to? Did he really have to go through all of that? But I mean, our sins are so great that he was just paying the price all along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just think he just endured all of that because of us, and because of the Israelites that we have been even just like reading about. Like, like he paid for all those sins, right? All that idolatry and treating each other badly, and then up until now, all the things that we are still doing. Like, it's just it just grieves my heart to know that like I had anything to do with that.
Yeah, no, that is pretty sad. You could probably just rest in that moment on just the weight of that, and I think it's worth doing so and reflecting on, because it is significant, man. It is because of us and our sin, right? That he had to do that. But yeah, I do think to your point, it shows the weight and the influence that Jesus had, that it wasn't even a typical crucifixion, right? Like, mind you, crucifixions were already bad enough. This was a common practice for how they would often kill certain criminals. But like, for even by crucifixion standards, what took place, before Jesus was a lot. But heard the story, read the story numerous times. You'll get it in all four gospels. It's one of the few pieces that is definitely in all four gospels, with some small variations as far as maybe what he said or things of that nature. But I think the thing that stuck out to me that I just never paid much attention to in 27 was at his death, verse 52 and 53.
Yes.
Like,
I started at 51.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've said 51. I know, like, at least it never really, that's something that's been commonly said to me, that like, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two, from top to bottom, the earthquake, and the rock was split. Like, that's every Easter we gotta talk about that. But I don't know if we ever mentioned the fact that these tombs are opened, and many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, entered the holy city, and appeared to many.
Yeah.
Like, when I read that, I was like, how long has this been here?
That's creepy.
I'm sorry, no, for real. I was like, this has always been in the scripture, in this text? Because I don't know how many times I've read Matthew 27.
It's
but
creepy.
Like, that's there. But yeah, like, others were resurrected after his resurrection and appeared to people. That was so interesting. So I mean, I had to do a whole bunch of reading, because I was just like, I've never really come across this. And again, it's kind of it's a belief that these are like recent saints, quote unquote. Like, these aren't like, it's not like Moses was raised, or Elijah. They way gone.
The like homeboy that died last week.
Yeah,
he back.
That's so creepy.
Crazy.
Yeah. Again, it just never stuck out to me. But again, it's just so interesting that Matthew mentions it in the midst of what else he's doing. But yeah. Was there something else you said? You said it started at 51. Was there something else from there that you wanted to say, or was it just the fact that it was creepy? Is all that jumped out?
Well, yeah, no, it jumped out to me because it was creepy, but also because I don't know, this whole darkness that happens, and then this earthquake that happened. It didn't resonate as much with me until we read through the prophets right before it, where there was continuously this rhetoric that like the sun will go darken and the earth will shake and quake. And it just, I mean, from prophet to prophet, it kind of like talked about this day of the Lord, right? Day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. And just to see it here, that it actually happened, right? At his death. And this day of the Lord was interesting to me. I saw it in a different light, because yes, I've heard it before, seen it plenty of times, right? But the reasons why, and like even just the foretelling of that, didn't really merge together for me until now.
Yeah. That's good. But yeah, so I mean, ultimately he's buried. People are, I mean, the centurion who's watching him acknowledges him. There's that fun movie, is that Risen? I think that kind of follows a theoretical story of kind of what that might have been like for that centurion. Yeah, it's kind of a cool movie. They come up with this has always been interesting, that they have this lie they've made up essentially to say like, hey, when his body is stolen, or when his body rises, that his disciples must have come back and stole it, and that's kind of the lie that's told a little bit thereafter. And of course he does rise. He appears to the women first, and then he tells them to go get the rest of the disciples. I don't know, what was interesting to you here in 28, or as we kind of close out today's conversation?
Yeah, I think it was the beginning. I think this is Pastor Andy Stanley used to say this, where he was always mentioning how the validity of like the gospels and stuff, and how that they told women first, and anybody who was making up a story during this time or there shortly after, like, would not have included women as being.
Well, like, if they wanted any credibility,
they wanted, if they want any credibility from it, because women were not seen as like credible sources, reliable sources. Like, their word was not taken as truth.
I mean, not even legally. Like, you could be in court and a woman's word in court like meant nothing.
Meant nothing, because her husband could be like, yeah, no, she didn't mean that.
Yeah.
And literally they had to nullify everything that she just said, right? And so the fact that he appeared to women first and told them to tell the disciples was just like another check in the box of like why this probably did happen then, right? Because we're using women. Anybody who makes up a story, if they want it to be believable, they're not going to use women. And so so that part jumped out to me. Anything for you?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, obviously we've gone through these stories before. I don't know if there was anything unique, but I said this earlier, I guess this would have been last week's conversations, probably. I can't remember where we were in Matthew, but just the Great Commission and just kind of comparing it to when he sent out his disciples the first time and had all that additional content about like, they're going to persecute you and, all that kind of stuff. And so just to kind of see him send them off here in a concise way here at the end of 28.
Yeah.
And, you
talking about like verse 18?
Right. Yeah. So, 18, I guess starting in verse 16, but yeah, what he actually says to them starts in 18. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Yeah.
And so, that's what we have come to know as the Great Commission. But I think like reading it, I read it with the context of what he said to the disciples earlier of like, not only am I sending you, but no, there will still be persecution, and you will like all that stuff to me comes with that. And so I just kind of read it in that same context this time around, like, or from that same lens. But anything else 28 for you?
No, I mean, there was a lot, but it's gonna let it ride.
Yeah, well, again, we will hear his burial and resurrection story again.
Plenty of times. Yeah.
A couple more times. We pick up in Mark on Monday, and we'll read the entire Gospel of Mark next week. Only 16 chapters, the shortest of the Gospels there. So pick that up and talk a little bit more about his death, burial, resurrection that time, and maybe something else God will give us next week. But appreciate you guys joining us for the Vibes Daily Podcast. Come back and see us Monday as we continue through the Gospels with the Gospel of Mark. And hopefully, again, continue to invite people. Join us next week. Tell somebody about it. Again, they can pick up kind of at any point and still get so much richness of God's word at any point that they open their Bible. But appreciate you joining us. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then.
Thank you for joining us for the Vibes Daily Podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the Vibes Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.